Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya, and welcome to another episode of TFI Let's Talk. And today we have with us once again Dave Bermingham, Director of Customer Success at SIOS Technology. Dave, it's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be back.
And today we are going to talk about disaster recovery for critical applications. Can you explain what kind of applications are we talking about here?
Yeah, so business critical applications could run anything from your database servers to your SAP infrastructure, really anything that your business relies on that is, if you were without it, it would be problematic. So usually it's defined in your business continuity plan, where people look at all your liabilities of what would happen if if payroll went offline, we couldn't pay employees. Is that critical? Yes, but is it as critical as, our orders, getting our orders shipped out the door? That happens every day, all day. So usually business critical applications are categorized in different levels of criticality.
So we are talking about business critical applications here. Can you also talk about how expensive this downtime of business critical application be for companies, and what do companies typically do to protect these applications?
So downtime, again, that should be well defined in your business continuity plan. So once you realize that if we can't take orders or we can't ship product or our online inventory system is offline, you can usually pretty easily put a dollar sign to that. And there's lots of studies out there you can look up. It could be anywhere from thousands of dollars an hour to millions of dollars per hour, depending on the size of the business and the criticality of the application. So it's up to the business to really define what the cost of downtime is. And once they've identified that, then they have to address the availability of that application. So there are usually many moving components to ensure that a service is available to the end user. So a lot of times you start at the back end, and so you're looking at, if you think SAP, where they have components for every part, every industry, but at the core of that SAP infrastructure is usually a database. It could be HANA database, could be Oracle, could be MaxDB, or something along those lines. And now we're talking about high availability clustering at the database layer. So they're implementing, high availability clustering solutions, like we have a SIOS that's going to do a combination of application level monitoring, system level monitoring. Typically, data replication now is very common. Instead of relying on shared storage, keeping the data in sync across different data centers or different cloud availability zones, cloud regions. But that's just one component of the back-end databases that customers need to provide high availability for. But they need to look at the entire infrastructure. So from the networking to the application server. So for web servers, you might be looking at web server farms, where you're not only distributing the load across web servers, but it also gives you a level of redundancy should one of those servers fails. And how are your clients connecting? If you're doing a hybrid cloud connection, the network between on-premises to the cloud is very important. If that network is severed, then you have no access to that application. And even if you're looking at, the cloud service providers are trying to make it easy for you today, so you can consume software as a service, or platform as a service, or database as a service. And then usually there's different levels you can sign up for. If you want to leverage Azure SQL or RDS and AWS, you can do that database as a service at an entry-level tier that doesn't guarantee any level of availability, or a very low guarantee, and there's no ability to fail across regions. And we just saw last week there was a major outage in Azure Europe, where Azure SQL databases were offline. If you hadn't configured that extra redundancy to be able to fail over to a different region, you were going to experience downtime. So that's how some of the companies will address that. You got to look at the whole service that you're offering and all the different components, make sure each component has redundancy.
I want to ask an interesting question because we do use the word disaster a lot of time. It could mean different thing in different context. So it could be disaster, could be natural disaster. It could be a man-made disaster, or it could be a component failure. So when we talk about disaster here, uh, what kind of disaster are we typically talking about? Because some disasters we have control over, some disasters we don't. Irrespective of our control over the disaster, we should have control over the backup and availability.
Yeah, at SIOS, we address high availability and disaster recovery. So you want to kind of start there. What are we addressing with high availability? We're addressing things that we anticipate will happen, failures that we anticipate will happen, whether it's a hardware failure or a system level failure or an update that's gone wrong, or something happens to the application stack, and you want to have another server ready to take over immediately with no data loss. That's high availability, right? We get into disaster recovery. Now we're addressing things that you 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 hope you don't have to experience. You hope that you will never experience. So, like you mentioned, the things that people think about disaster recovery, you always think about the floods or the major power outage or a fire, those natural disasters. Of course, that's a disaster, but I mean, you can. There's more likely, especially we look into cloud. A lot of the cloud disasters where availability zones, entire availability zones are offline, or entire regions offline. Usually they're man-made disasters. Someone made a mistake, or some kind of rollout went wrong, unanticipated downtime, and so that's a disaster because it's not expected, and if you haven't planned for it, you're going to be offline, right? But there's other disasters too. I mean, obviously we're the pandemic we all just have been through. All of a sudden you're locked. No one come into the office, and so that's you can imagine a much worse scenario where you really no one should go into the office, and that's if you're not planning in your disaster recovery plan, your business continuity plan, you have to imagine all these scenarios that could happen to you. Another disaster, which is much more common, is people hacking into your systems, and whether encrypting all your drives, and they want a ransom to give you back access to your data. Do you have a plan to address that, or do you have a big checkbook to write that check to get your data back? All these are need to be accounted for when you're thinking about disasters. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. You could sit here all day and just imagine all what could potentially happen, and are we protected in that scenario? Honestly, you're probably never going to be protected in every single scenario. You need to find what level of protection that you're comfortable with, and you'd have to do some risk mitigation with the rest of the disasters, and live with your decisions.
It is wrong to say that disaster recovery or preparedness for any kind of such disaster or high availability is less of a product or a destination and more of a journey and a process that, as you said, you have to have that because things will change. There are so many variables that will keep changing. It's not like you flick the button and now everything has been taken care of. What are your thoughts on that?
Throwing around this idea of a business continuity plan and a disaster recovery plan. So before I start defining that, the business continuity plan is the continuity plan for the entire business. That includes the information systems, and that's as a technical person, I'm usually concerned about the databases and the IT. But what about the people and the communications and just the office space itself? There's a whole slew of other things that the business continuity plan needs to address that the IT manager will never have to be concerned about, but it's the business needs to be concerned about. So there's all that as part of your business continuity plan. So of course there's not a single software solution to address entire disasters. There's consultants that can help you identify and help you plan your business continuity plan. But when it comes down to the technology, then there's something called the disaster recovery plan, which is part of your overall business continuity plan, and that's where you identify all your systems and you categorize them in kind of levels of importance. And usually at that level, when you categorize them, you get to a point where you define a recovery time objective, or RTO, and a recovery point objective, or RPO. So you hear those terms thrown around. And that just says, okay, what are our goals in the event of a disaster, regardless of what it is? We've defined all the disasters we think might happen. How long can we withstand being offline before it severely impacts our business? And so you define that. And then you also define how much data are we okay with losing. And it could be different for the different levels of applications, right? And so once you define those, then you have to identify solutions that will help you meet those RTOs and RPOs. So at SIOS, we're delivering HA solutions, which are zero data loss, and recovery time objectives of minute or less typically, and so we're addressing high availability, and that's done with clustering software and synchronous replication. But then you can take the same technology and extend it across greater distances to your DR site or to a different cloud region, and that's to address your disaster recovery plan, and that's done with asynchronous replication. So your recovery point objective immediately goes from zero data loss to some amount of data loss, but we're usually talking about seconds or less of data loss when you're doing real-time asynchronous replication, compared to something that maybe not quite as business critical, where you're okay with doing backups, daily backups, and then replicating those backups offsite, or shipping tapes offsite, or whatever your backup plan includes that gets that data offsite. And the recovery is going to be taking a little bit longer because you got to restore backups, and that'll be fine for your less business critical applications. But for those ones that are defined as business critical, then you're going to want to look at solutions that minimize that RTO and RPO as much as possible.
Cloud is seen as a magical place. Isn't it like, why can't companies just run their application in the cloud? Doesn't it like offer like protection of geographic separation also in some cases?
Cloud is a big word, encompasses a lot of things. So there's, cloud software as a service, and many people now, they're no longer running their own Exchange server for email, right? They're going to use Office 365 or Gmail or some, hosted mail service. And so you're relying on the cloud provider to ensure that that service remains online, and you have no control over that. Do you want to have a plan that if Office 365 goes offline, what do I do for email? So you might want to have a backup plan that includes, redirecting email through another, server through some MX, DNS manipulation. And having local backups of your email. So you might want to address that, because the cloud can only do so much. It's still, you're relying on someone else to do your work for you, right? Then there's the infrastructure as a service, which is where SIOS plays, where you're managing your own servers, and you're configuring your own networking, and you're configuring your security, and you're deploying virtual machines, and you're installing operating systems and applications, and it's incumbent upon you to also layer in high availability on top of that. The cloud gives you the infrastructure, so of course they have different regions for disaster recovery, geographically dispersed regions. But they also have availability zones, which are different data centers, but in the same region. And typically they're used to configure high availability, but it's still incumbent upon the user to configure that. They give you the tools, and they give you, the components, but it's really up to you to build out the infrastructure to take advantage of all the tools and components and infrastructure that are provided for you.
When we look at all these problems, let's quickly talk about how is SIOS helping companies, developers to have a very good disaster recovery posture and strategy.
SIOS is a software company that focuses on high availability disaster recovery. And so we have solutions that work on the Windows platform and the Linux platform. And on the Linux platform, we have a product called Lifekeeper that is a high availability clustering suite that includes, clustering software that does all the monitoring of your system, your application, the networking, the storage, and then we extend the core functionality, what we call the application recovery kits. So it has intelligence to know how to, build protection for SAP, for Oracle, for HANA, for all your typical business critical applications that you might run on Linux. And then it also includes our replication engine called DataKeeper. So it allows you to build these HA clusters that span data centers. So in the cloud, that means spanning availability zones, which is critical for building disaster recovery solutions. And then also that DataKeeper replication can be configured to do asynchronous replication to an entirely different cloud region or a hybrid cloud or even multi-cloud type configuration where you're getting your data much further away. So if you have a more regional wide failure, you can recover things quickly with minimal data loss in an entirely different region. Similar solution on the Windows space with DataKeeper doing all the same type of replication, but we integrate with Windows Server failover clustering. So the clustering solution that comes with your operating system, which normally relies on some sort of shared storage device, can now be configured without shared storage and can use just your local storage, and then you can protect any of your business critical applications, whether it's SQL Server or SAP, ERS, ASCS, Oracle, anything you might run on Windows in a cluster. Now you can build what we call a SANless version of that. So that's again for high availability, same concept. You just put your servers in different availability zones, or for disaster recovery, put them in a different region, or combination. Many people will have 3-node clusters with one doing synchronous replication in the same region and then a third node in a different region doing asynchronous replication.
Dave, thank you so much for once again talking about disaster recovery, high availability. And once again, thanks for sharing those insights there. And as usual, I would love to have you back on the show. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'll come back anytime.